I have buried men I liked better than I understood, and I have watched land I loved turn to powder and blow away over a fence line into somebody else's county. But I never once, in 61 years of standing on this dirt, saw a man lose everything he had and stay standing the way Clete Harmon stayed standing. You want to know why a horse matters. You're thinking it's just an animal, 4 legs and a tail, and a habit of stepping on your foot when you're not looking. I thought that too. I thought that for most of my life, and I made my living around them, which tells you how a man can be right next to a thing every day and still not see it. So let me tell you about the night the auctioneer's chalk was already dry on Clete's gate, when the bank had a paper with his name on it that meant the farm wasn't his anymore, when I found him sitting in the middle of a dead cornfield with a shotgun across his knees and no shells in his pocket. I checked, later, and there weren't any, and I've never told him I looked. And then I'll tell you about the horse. But you have to understand the losing first. A man who hands you a gift you didn't see coming, you can't feel what it cost him unless you know how empty his hands were the second before. Otherwise, it's just a horse. And it was never just a horse. My name is Eli Ward. I keep no diary, but I keep count. Nails, favors, debts, the number of days since it last rained. I hold numbers in my head the way some men hold grudges, and I never let one go. When my Ada was alive, she used to say I could tell her how many eggs the hens had laid that spring, but not what day our anniversary fell on. She was right. She's been gone 11 years and 4 months, and I still nail a horseshoe over any door I walk through more than twice, points up so the luck don't run out. Though I stopped believing in luck around the same time, I stopped believing the rain would come back. This is the story of the worst year Clete Harmon ever had, and the one good thing in it. The first I knew that Clete was finished was the flatbed truck. It came up the section road slow, the way a truck comes when the man driving it doesn't want to get where he's going. I was mending the west fence, wire, not because the wire needed it, but because I needed my hands doing something. My knuckles were split from the cold snap and I couldn't hardly grip the pliers. And I remember thinking a man my age has got no business out in a March wind pretending a coyote broke fence was worth the blood. But I was out there. I saw the truck. It had a for sale sign leaned in the bed, and the county assessor's seal on the door, and it turned in at Clete's gate. I put down the pliers. Now Clete Harmon and I were not friends exactly, if you want to be strict about the word. We were neighbors, which out here is a bigger thing and a smaller thing at once. Bigger because when your wife is dying in February, the neighbor is who drives 40 miles for the doctor while you hold her hand, and Clete did that for me. God as my witness, drove Ada to Thurman with the chains rattling on his tires the whole way, and never said a word about the $15 of gas. Smaller because in 20 years of that, we never once sat down and had a beer for the pleasure of it. Men out here love each other by showing up. We are terrible at saying so. I watched the assessor's man knock. I watched Clete come to the door. I couldn't hear a thing at that distance. Understand. Just 2 shapes on a porch, one of them holding papers, one of them holding the door frame like the porch had started to tip. But I have replayed that little silent scene so many times I have half convinced myself I heard it. The assessor talking soft. Clete going still. That kind of still a deer goes when it's already been shot and doesn't know yet that it's dying. That half a second where the body still thinks the world is the same shape it was. The papers changed hands. The assessor got back in his truck and drove out, and I wanted on the record that the man wasn't cruel about it. He even lifted 2 fingers off the wheel at me as he passed, a country wave, one working man to another, and I've thought since that the ones who take a farm from you are mostly just tired men doing a job they hate. That doesn't make it hurt less, but it's true. Clete stood on his porch a long time. I counted, because that's what I do. I counted, and he stood there for something past 11 minutes without moving, and the wind was coming out of the northwest at a mean clip, cold enough to make your eyes run, and he never once turned his collar up against it. A man who won't turn his collar up in that wind is a man who has stopped feeling his own skin. I didn't go over. I want you to know that too, because it's the part I'm least proud of. I stood at my fence with the pliers in the dirt, and I did not walk the quarter-mile to my neighbor's porch, and the reason was the worst reason there is. I didn't know what to say. I was afraid of the not knowing. So I let a man be alone with the end of his life because I couldn't stand the weight of my own tongue. I went home. I nailed a horseshoe over my back door that I'd already nailed a shoe over 3 years prior, just to have something to hammer. Let me tell you how a farm dies, since most people have never had the misfortune of watching it up close and think it happens all at once. It doesn't. It happens the way a big animal dies, slow in stages, with the eyes going last. Clete had 400 acres his grandfather broke to the plow with a mule team in a year nobody now living remembers. Wheat mostly, some corn on the low ground by the creek where the soil stayed sweet. He ran maybe 60 head of cattle in the good years, and in the good years Clete Harmon was as prosperous a man as this country grows, which is to say he owed the bank a little every spring and paid it back a little more every fall and considered himself rightly a rich man in the only currency that counts out here. He owned the ground his people were buried in. Then the rain quit. It quit the way a friend quits calling. You don't notice the exact day, you just look up one season and realize it's been a long while. First one dry summer, which is nothing, we get those, that's ranching. Then two. By the third the creek that fed his low corn had gone to a string of green puddles you could step over, and the cattle were eating hay in July, which any man out here will tell you is the sound of a farm's back breaking. Hay in summer is money going out with nothing coming in. Clete sold 20 head to buy feed for the 40 that were left. Next spring he sold 20 more. The bank was patient a good while. Banks are patient right up until they aren't, and the day they stop being patient is always a day you didn't see coming even though you saw it coming for years. That's the cruelty of it. You know the whole time. You just keep telling yourself the rain will come back, the way I keep nailing up horseshoes, and then one March morning an assessor knocks on your door. I found out the rest over the following weeks, the way you find out anything out here, at the co-op, at the feed store, from Del Cranmer who runs the grain elevator and knows everybody's business the way a spider knows its web. The mortgage was called. The land was going to auction end of April. Clete had been served, and Clete, being Clete, had told nobody. Had gone right on doing his chores every morning like a farm still needed doing, feeding animals he no longer owned on land that was no longer his. Because a man who has done a thing every day for 40 years does not know how to stop, and stopping would have been an admission, and Clete Harmon would rather have died than admit. His wife had passed 4 years before mine, lung thing. Their boy Danny had gone off to the oil fields down in Texas and sent money home for a while and then, the way boys do, sent it less. And then the money was going the other direction. Danny needing a little, Danny's truck broke down, Danny's girl in trouble, until Clete was propping up 2 households on a farm that couldn't hold up one. I don't say that against the boy. A boy in Texas can't see the dust on his father's shoulders. He hears I'm fine on a crackling phone line, and he believes it because he needs to. So there was Clete, 63 years old, alone, on the last month of the last farm his family would ever own, and me a quarter-mile east too much of a coward to walk over. The night I found him in the field was the 9th of April. I know because I keep count. It was cold for April, a late frost coming, the kind that kills the fruit trees and makes the old men at the co-op shake their heads. I couldn't sleep, hadn't been sleeping right if I'm honest since the assessor's truck, my conscience picking at me like a scab. Around midnight I gave it up and went out on my porch to look at the stars because Ada always said a bad conscience can't survive a sky that big, and she was mostly right, and I was standing there letting the cold do its work when I saw the light. It was down in Clete's dead cornfield. Just a little glow low to the ground wandering, a lantern. Now a light in a man's own field at midnight can mean a dozen things, most of them nothing. A calf out, a coyote at the chickens. But there was something in the way it wandered, aimless, that put a cold hand on the back of my neck that had nothing to do with the frost. A man with a purpose walks his light straight. This light drifted like the man behind it had forgotten where he meant to go. I don't run anymore. My knees quit that years back. But I walked the quarter-mile faster than these old legs had moved since Ada's last night, and I climbed the fence instead of walking down to the gate, tore my coat on the top wire and didn't care, and I came up on that light out of breath and shaking and calling his name before I could even see him. Clete, it's Eli. He was sitting down in the dirt between two rows of last year's dead corn, the stalks rattling over him in the wind like dry bones talking. The lantern was set beside him, and across his knees, catching the lantern light dull along the barrel, was his shotgun. I stopped. I want to be careful here, because this is a heavy thing and I have never spoke of it to another living soul, and I'll not have it made into something cheap. He did not point that gun at himself while I watched. I never saw him do a single thing you could stand up in a court and call intent. What I saw was a broken man sitting in a dead field in the middle of the night with a gun on his lap, and his face gone somewhere I couldn't follow, and every hair on my body stood up and said, "Hurry." So I did the only thing my scared old brain could think to do. I didn't lunge for the gun. You never lunge. My daddy taught me that with a rattlesnake, and it holds for a great deal more than snakes. I sat down. I sat down in the cold dirt next to Clete Harmon, close enough that our shoulders near touched, and I did not say one word about the gun. I looked out at the dark where his dead corn stood, and I said the stupidest, smallest, truest thing that came to me. "Frost's coming. Gonna get the Wilbur's peaches." Clete didn't answer for a long time. The wind talked in the corn. Somewhere off toward the creek an owl said its one sad thing over and over. Then he said, in a voice I didn't recognize, all the grit worn out of it, "Ground's not even mine to freeze." "No," I said, "I heard. Whole town heard, I expect. Some of it, Dell tells it wrong. Always does." And Clete Harmon laughed. It wasn't much of a laugh. It was one bad, broken breath pushed out through his nose. But it was a laugh, and I have hung more hope on smaller things. Because a man who can still find one thin thread of the ridiculous, a man who can laugh at Del Cranmer getting the story wrong even while he's sitting in the ruin of his whole life, that man has a little something left in him yet. Not much. But a coal's a coal, and you can build a fire on a coal if you're careful, and you don't let the wind get at it. I did not take the gun. I want you to know that. I sat with him in that field until the frost came down white on both our shoulders and my backside went numb as a stone. And around 3 in the morning, without either of us saying anything about it, Clete picked up the shotgun by the barrel. By the barrel, muzzle pointed at the dirt. The way you carry a gun you've decided isn't going to be a problem tonight. And he stood up, and his knees cracked as loud as mine, and he said, "You want coffee, you old fool, you're froze." We went in his kitchen. He made coffee on a stove that would be somebody else's stove in 3 weeks, and I sat at his table and did not say one single wise or comforting thing, because I didn't have any, and I have come to believe that the not saying was the only wise thing I did that whole spring. Here's what I keep circling back to, all these years on. I have laid awake more nights than I can count wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed in my bed. If I'd told my conscience to hush and pulled the quilt up. The light in the field would have wandered a while, and then it would have stopped wandering, and I'd have woke to a different world, and there'd be no story to tell you, only a hole in the ground and a boy called back from Texas too late. I'm not telling you I saved him. I don't believe that, not really. I think a man saves himself or he doesn't, and all a neighbor can do is sit close enough that the man remembers he's not the last person left on earth. That's all I did. I sat close. I made the loss have a witness, and I have come to think that loneliness is the thing that actually kills you, not the losing. The losing you can survive. It's doing the losing alone in the dark with nobody to hear you. That's the part no man is built to carry. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and my Ada would tell you I always do. I always want to give you the meaning before I've given you the story, like handing a man dessert before he's had his supper. So let me back up, because after that night in the field something happened, and it started 3 days later with a stranger and a horse, and it is the reason I sat down to tell you any of this at all. The stranger came up the section road on foot, leading a horse, and I saw him before Clete did because I was, by then, watching Clete's place the way you watch a pot you're afraid will boil over, stopping by twice a day on made-up errands, borrowing back tools I'd lent him years ago, generally making a nuisance of myself in the hope that a man with a nosy neighbor underfoot has a harder time despairing in peace. The stranger was an Apache man. I judged him near my own age, though it's a fool who guesses another man's years, and he moved like a younger one. That economy some men keep their whole lives, no motion wasted, the walk of somebody who has crossed a great deal of hard country on his own 2 feet and expects to cross more. He wore a good hat gone soft with age and a canvas coat, and he led the horse on a loose rope, not hauling it, the two of them walking together more like partners than like a man and his property. I'll tell you plain, because I won't pretty up who I was. I was raised in a time and a place that taught me to be wary of a face like his, and I am not proud of the man I was raised to be. But I had also lived long enough by then to have learned that most of what I was taught to fear turned out, on closer acquaintance, to be just people, tired, decent, complicated people, same as me. And I had made it a rule in my old age to judge a man by his hands and his eyes, and not by what my daddy would have made of him. His hands were a horseman's hands, scarred and gentle. His eyes took the measure of me quick and didn't flinch. I decided I liked him before he'd said a word, and I have never once had cause to change my mind. He stopped at Clete's gate. I was near enough, pretending to check a water trough, to hear. "I'm looking for the Harmon place," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "You found it," I said, "though there's some question whose place it is come may." He looked at me steady. "The bank's, I heard, in town, that's why I came." I didn't follow that and said so. "Man's about to lose everything," the stranger said, like it was the most natural thing in the world, "and I've got something he needs. Seems like the time to bring it." And he looked at the horse. Now I have been around horses my whole life, thousands of them, good and bad and every shade between, and I am telling you that when I looked at that animal the hair stood up on my arms the same as it had in the cornfield. Only this was a different feeling entirely. This was the feeling you get in a church when you were expecting an empty room. I don't have the words for it. I've tried for years and I don't. It was a bay mare, not young, with a white star and one white sock and a scar along her neck like a lightning crack. There was nothing about her a horse trader would have paid extra for. And yet standing there in the road she had a stillness, a kind of deep waiting patience, that I have seen in exactly one other place in my life, and that was in my Ada in her last week, when she'd stopped being afraid of dying and had gone somewhere ahead of the rest of us and was just quietly, kindly waiting for us to catch up. I don't expect you to believe me. I'm an old man and old men see things, but I looked at that mare and I thought, clear as a bell, there you are, like I'd been waiting on her. Like the whole spring had been a held breath, and here, finally, was the letting of it. "What she cost?" I said, because I'm a rancher and even in a church I'll ask the price. The Apache man smiled, just a little at the corners. "Not for sale," he said. "That's the thing you don't understand yet." He looked toward Clete's house, where a shape had come to stand in the doorway, drawn by the voices. "Neither of you do, but you will by morning." And Clete Harmon stepped out onto the porch of the farm he'd already lost, and saw the horse, and something happened in his face that I hadn't seen there in 3 dry years, and I knew right then. The way you know the weather's about to turn before a single cloud shows, that whatever this was, it was going to change everything. The Apache man's name was Naiche, though I didn't learn it until later that night, and I'll come to how. But first I have to tell you what happened on Clete Harmon's porch, because I stood 12 feet from it and watched. And in 61 years I have witnessed births and deaths, and a tornado take a barn straight up into the sky board by board. And I have never seen anything work on a man's face the way that mare worked on Clete's. He came out slow. He'd been keeping to the house mostly since the field. I knew because I'd made it my business to know, and a man who was fine would have been out doing chores at that hour, and Clete was not out doing chores. He came out squinting like the daylight was a stranger he owed money to. And then he saw the horse and he stopped. I've told you about the deer still. This wasn't that. This was the opposite of that. This was a man who'd been holding so still for so long, holding himself together by sheer stubbornness, and something in him just loosened. His shoulders came down off his ears where they'd been living for 3 years. His mouth opened a little, and he made a sound I won't try to spell for you, a short broken thing that wasn't a word, the sound a man makes when a thing he'd stopped letting himself want walks up his road on a lead rope. Where, Clete said, that was all he could get out. Where? Naiche didn't answer that. He answered a different question, one Clete hadn't asked out loud. You're the one lost the wheat ground down by the creek, he said. Grandfather broke it with mules. Clete's jaw worked. How do you? Because I knew a man who knew that ground, Naiche said. 40 years back, before your time near enough, and I made him a promise and I'm a long time keeping it and I'd about given up finding the right day. Then I heard in town the Harmon place was going under. He ran his hand down the mare's neck over the lightning scar. So the day found me. Now I'm a plain man and I don't hold with mystery for its own sake, and I could feel the impatience coming up in me. I'm the kind who wants the price and the terms and the whole thing laid on the table. But there was something in how Naiche talked that made you hold your questions. Not because he was hiding, because you could tell the answer was long and heavy, and he meant to give you the whole of it or none, and he'd give it in his own time or not at all. Come dark, he said, I'll tell you the both of you what this is. There's coffee owed and a story with it. Right now. And here he looked at the mare and then at Clete, and something passed between the man and the animal that I swear had words in it though none were spoke. Right now she needs a stall and water, and you've got both, and it'll do you more good to fill a bucket than it will me. And that was the first thing. You'll think it's small. It wasn't. Clete Harmon, who had not, by my count, done a single act of care for another living creature in 3 weeks, who'd been feeding his own animals like a sleepwalker, going through it dead-eyed. Clete filled a water bucket. And I watched him do it, and I watched something come back into his hands while he did, some old competence, the muscle memory of 40 years of being a man who took care of things. He led the mare to his barn. He forked down hay. He checked her feet, one by one, running his thumb along the frog of each hoof the way a horseman does without thinking. And when he got to the off hind, she leaned into him, put her weight against his shoulder the way a tired horse will with somebody it's decided to trust. And Clete Harmon stood there in his own barn holding up a strange horse's weight. And he cried. I turned away. Some things a man's got a right to do without an audience, and I'd already seen more of Clete's insides that spring than either of us was comfortable with. I went and sat on an upturned bucket outside the barn door, and I counted the boards on the wall across from me, which is a thing I do when a feeling gets too big. I find something to count, and by the time I'd counted the boards twice and the nails in them, once Clete came out with his face washed of it, and neither of us said a word about anything. Strangers staying for supper, Clete said. Seems so, I said. You too, I expect, since you've made a career of loitering on my property lately. Somebody's got to, I said. You're a poor hand at loitering yourself, always working. And Clete looked at me, and there was something in it. A kind of I know what you've been doing, you old fool, and I know why, and he didn't say thank you because out here we don't, and he didn't have to. Beans and cornbread, he said, it's what there is. It's what there always is, I said. Man could set his watch by your beans. Now I have to do the thing my Ada hated, which is stop the story to tell you about myself. Because you can't understand what came after supper unless you understand what I brought to that table. I told you I'd made it a rule in my old age not to judge a man by his face. That's true. But rules are things a man makes because his nature runs the other way, and my nature, the one my daddy poured into me like setting a fence post in concrete, ran hard the other way. My daddy fought Apache. That's the word he used, fought, though from the stories I've since learned it was closer to hunted. And he raised me on a version of history where we were the ones wronged and they were the danger in the dark. And I believed every word of it until I was near 40 and had cause to learn different. The cause was a man named Sam Bishad, a Navajo, not Apache, though at the time I couldn't have told you the difference and wouldn't have thought it worth learning. I hired him in a bad year when no white hand would work for what I could pay, and I hired him meaning to keep one eye on him. And inside of a month that man had saved my best horse from a twisted gut with nothing but his hands and a patience I didn't possess. And inside of a year he'd become the closest thing to a friend I had. And when he moved on, men like Sam always moved on. The country never let them stay put long. He left a hole in my days I've never quite filled. I learned from Sam Bishad that everything my daddy taught me about a certain kind of face was a lie a scared man tells to make his own cruelty feel like courage. So when Naiche sat down at Clete's table that night, I did not see what my daddy would have seen. I saw Sam. I saw a man who'd crossed hard country and been made to feel he didn't belong on any of it, and had crossed it anyway, and had come now on foot leading a horse to keep a 40-year promise to a dead man. And I found I wanted very badly to hear what that promise was. The lamp was lit. The beans were gone. Clete had found, God knows where, half a bottle of something amber and poured 3 fingers into 3 mismatched jars, and Naiche turned his sloe between his hands without drinking and looked into it like the story was down at the bottom. The man I made the promise to, he said, was called Coyote Who Waits. That's a poor translation. It loses the joke in it. He was named for patience, and he was the least patient man I ever knew, and the name was his people's way of teasing him about it his whole life. White men called him Charlie. And he knew my grandfather's ground, Clete said. He worked it, Naiche said. 1928-29. Your grandfather hired him when the drought came, the first drought, the one folks forget, the one before the big Dust Bowl one. Charlie was a young man then and a good hand with stock, and your grandfather was a young man too, and they were both trying to keep a farm alive through a dry that wanted it dead. He turned the jar. Your grandfather couldn't pay him in money. Nobody had money. He paid him in something else. In what? Naiche looked up, and his eyes went from Clete to me and back, taking his time. In a foal, he said. A bay filly with a white star, out of the best mare your grandfather owned. That's the payment. That's how Charlie started his own line of horses, and his son ran them after him, and I ran them after his son, because Charlie had no more sons living and he'd taught me the way you teach a boy of your own. Every bay mare I've bred for 40 years traces back to that filly your grandfather gave a hungry Apache in a dry year when he had nothing else to give. He set the jar down. That mare in your barn is the last of them, and she is more of your grandfather's making than she is mine. The lamp popped, nobody moved. Charlie told me, Naiche went on quieter now, near the end, and he was a long time dying, that man, patient even at that. The name got the last laugh on him. He told me, the Harmons kept me alive one dry year and never made me feel it as charity, and there'll come a dry year when they're the ones going under and you'll know it, and you'll take them the best horse of the line, and you'll say Charlie sent it, and you won't take $1 for it. Naiche spread his scarred hands. I told him he was a foolish old man making promises across 50 years he'd no way to hold me to. And he laughed and he said, I don't have to hold you to it. You'll do it because it's owed, and because you're the kind of man who pays what's owed, or I wouldn't have wasted my life teaching you. The silence after that had weight to it. I could hear the mare shift in the barn through the open window, the good ordinary sound of a horse settling into strange straw and deciding to be all right. Clete's voice, when it came, was not steady. "You walked here." "Truck broke down at Thurman," Naiche said. 22 miles back. I could have waited on the part." He almost smiled. "But I'd already waited 40 years and I found myself in a hurry all of a sudden, so I walked. She and I have walked worse." "You walked 22 miles, Clete said, "to give a horse to a man you never met for a debt your own, for a debt that isn't even." "It's the only kind of debt that's real," Naiche said, and there was iron in it now, no give at all. "The kind nobody could make you pay. Your grandfather didn't owe Charlie kindness, he gave it. Charlie didn't owe me a life's teaching, he gave it. I don't owe you a horse." He looked at Clete straight down the barrel of it. "I give it. That's what makes it worth something. If I owed it, it'd just be arithmetic." I have thought about that line more than any other line any man ever said in my hearing. If I owed it, it'd just be arithmetic. Me, a man who counts everything, who's kept the ledger of every favor and debt his whole life. It went into me like a splinter and it's never worked back out. Because Naiche was right, and it undid something in me. All my counting, all my keeping track of who owed who, that was the small version of being a man. The big version was the thing you gave that no ledger could ever record, the thing that only counted because no one could make you do it. I didn't say any of that. I sat there with my whiskey I hadn't touched, and I let it go into me and stay. But Clete was somewhere else. Clete had gone pale under his weather brown, and I saw his hands had started to shake on the table, and I thought at first it was the story working on him. It wasn't. It was worse than that. It was arithmetic of his own. "I can't keep her," Clete said. The words came out of him, like they were being pulled with pliers. "I can't, Naiche, I don't have a farm. End of the month I don't have a barn to stall her in, nor a fence to hold her, nor a dollar to feed her, I've got nothing. You walked 22 miles to give the best horse of your line to a man who's about to be homeless." His voice cracked clean across. "You kept a 40-year promise to bring her to the worst possible place she could land. I can't take her. I'd be taking her down with me. I won't do it. Charlie didn't mean for you to hand her to a drowning man." And there it was, the heavy thing, the morally impossible thing, the kind of decision this whole spring had been sharpening itself toward. Because you have to understand what Clete was doing. This was the one good thing that had come to him in 3 years of ruin, the one warm thing, the one gift, the answer to the field and the shotgun and the frost on his shoulders, and he was, right there at the table, trying to refuse it, trying to give it back. Not out of pride, though there was pride in it, out of a kind of terrible love. He'd looked at that mare and he'd loved her instant and complete, the way I had in the road, and because he loved her he couldn't stand to be the ruin she landed in. He would rather lose her than fail her. I have known a great many men. I have known maybe 3 who'd have done what Clete did at that table. It's the rarest thing there is, to be handed the one thing you want, at the lowest moment of your life, and to try to hand it back because you love it too much to let it share your fall. Naiche listened to all of it. He didn't interrupt. When Clete ran down, when he'd said his whole desperate piece and sat there breathing hard, Naiche was quiet a while. Then he said, "You're not going to lose the farm." Clete laughed, that same one bad breath through the nose from the cornfield. "The bank's got a paper says otherwise. Auction's the 29th. "How much?" Naiche said. "What?" "The note. What's the number that makes it go away?" And Clete told him. He told him a number, and it was a large number, larger than I'd have guessed, and Naiche took it in the way a man takes in the far bank of a river he means to cross, measuring it, not fearing it. "That's a lot of horse," Naiche said. "It's not for sale," Clete said, throwing the man's own words back at him, and there was the first flash of the old Clete in it, the stubborn, ornery Clete I'd known for 20 years, and God help me, I was glad to see the mean streak surface, because a man too gentle to fight back is a man who's already given up. "You said so yourself, and I wouldn't sell her if she was. I'd sooner sell my grandfather's grave. I didn't say sell her, Naiche said. Here I have to slow down, because what Naiche laid out over the next hour is the crux of the whole thing, and if I rush it you'll think it was simpler than it was, and it was never simple. He did not have money. Let me say that plain, because you're maybe thinking the Apache man turned out to be secretly rich and paid off the farm, and that's a nice story and it's not this one. Naiche was poor as Clete, poorer, a man who owned a broke-down truck and a good hat and a line of horses 40 years in the making and not much beyond. He couldn't pay that note. But he knew horses, and more than that he knew that horse, knew what she was, knew her blood, knew that the mare standing in Clete's barn was, to the right eyes, worth more than any single one of us could see standing in a road. There's a man in Sonora, Naiche said, breeds for the old blood, the Spanish lines, the ones nobody's got clean anymore. He's been after this line of mine for 15 years and I've told him no 15 years running because I wasn't going to sell Charlie's blood to a rich man's ranch to make him richer. He turned the jar. But she's carrying. I hadn't known, I don't think Clete had either. We both looked toward the barn. Bred her before I left, to a stallion of the line I lost last winter to the cold, the last stud I had. So what's in her belly is the very last cross I'll ever get of Charlie's blood both sides. Naiche's voice had gone rough. That foal, once it's on the ground and weaned, that foal, the Sonora man would pay your note for and thank me and count himself lucky. One foal, not the mare. The mare stays here. She stays yours. You keep Charlie's blood alive on Harmon ground where it started, and you sell the one foal to the one man who will treasure it, and that's your note paid and nobody's grave gets sold. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the lamp burning. But the foal's not here, Clete said slowly. It's months off. The auction's the 29th. That's 19 days. There's no foal to sell in 19 days. The bank doesn't take a promise. No, Naiche agreed. The bank takes a paper. And he reached into his canvas coat and he brought out a paper of his own, folded soft, carried a long way, and he laid it on the table and turned it so we could read it, and it was a bill of sale and it was a breeding contract, and it was a letter of intent from the man in Sonora, dated and signed, a standing offer 15 years old and never withdrawn, promising a sum for any foal of this line that Naiche cared to part with. Legal. Bankable. A promise you could take to a bank, because bankers, whatever else they are, can read a signature and a sum. I've been carrying that offer 15 years, Naiche said, waiting to find a reason worth breaking my no. This is the reason. You take that paper to your bank. You show them what's coming. You show them the mare it's coming out of, standing in your barn, sound and bred, and you ask them not for forgiveness of the note. For 19 more days turned into 18 more months, enough time for a foal to hit the ground and grow up enough to sell. He sat back. Bankers hate a foreclosure. It's all cost and no money to them. Give a banker a real path to getting paid in full and he'll walk it because the paper's worth more to him whole than it is in pieces. That's the arithmetic they understand. And Clete Harmon sat there with a way out laid on his own kitchen table, real and solid and just barely possible, and I watched him not believe it. That's the thing about a man who's been drowning a long time. You throw him a rope and he doesn't grab it. He's forgotten his hands can grab. He's made his peace with the water. And the cruelest, hardest work of all is the work of getting a drowning man to believe the rope is real. Because if he grabs it and it isn't, if he lets himself hope and hope betrays him one more time, that's the thing that'll finish him for good, and some part of him knows it, and that part would rather drown certain than live on a maybe. It won't work, Clete said, but his voice wasn't sure. It might not, Naiche said. I won't lie to you, the banker might say no, the foal might come wrong, foals do. The Sonora man might have died and not told me. He shrugged, honest as a stone. It's a hope, not a guarantee, but you've been living without either. And I'd rather hand you a hope that might break than watch you sit in a dead field with a shotgun. Clete went still. You saw that, he said quietly. It wasn't a question. Town's small, Naiche said, And I've got eyes, and I know the look of a man who's decided. I've worn it." He let that sit, and there was a whole other story behind it that he didn't tell and I've never asked. "That's the real reason I walked the 22 miles instead of waiting on the truck part, Clete Harmon. I heard how you were, and I did the arithmetic, and I decided 19 days might be too many to wait. So I walked. I have left myself out of most of this last part on purpose, because it wasn't mine, it was theirs, 2 men and a debt and a horse. But I'll put myself back in for the end of the night, because there was one more thing. When it was late, and the bottle was down to nothing, and Naiche had gone out to check the mare one last time before he'd sleep in the hayloft like he insisted, wouldn't take Clete's spare bed, said he slept better near the horse, and I believed him. When it was just Clete and me at the table with the lamp burning low, Clete said to me, "You checked my pockets that night in the field." I hadn't meant to ever speak of it. I looked at my empty jar. "There weren't any shells," Clete said. "I know you checked. I felt you not say anything about it. You want to know why there weren't any shells." I didn't say anything. That's my one gift, the not saying. I let him get there himself. "Because I couldn't decide," Clete said. "I took the gun out to the field to make myself decide. And I sat there all night and I couldn't. I couldn't make myself load it, and I couldn't make myself go back inside, so I just sat, hating myself for being too much of a coward to do it and too much of a coward to quit thinking about it." His hands were flat on the table now, steady. "And then a fool neighbor climbed my fence and tore his coat and sat down next to me and told me the frost was coming for the Wilbur's peaches. He looked up. 'You didn't save my life, Eli. I want you to know that. You're going to spend the rest of your days thinking you did, and I need you to not, because it's a weight and it's not yours to carry.' 'All right,' I said. "'You didn't save me,' Clete said. 'You just made it so I wasn't alone with it. That's all. That's the whole of it.' His jaw worked. "But it turns out that's the thing. That's the whole thing, Eli. Being alone with it is the thing that kills you. The rest a man can stand." And I thought, there it is. The very thing I'd been circling for weeks and couldn't put words to, and Clete had just said it plain at his own kitchen table, that the losing you can survive, but the losing alone in the dark with no witness, that's what no man is built for. Out in the barn, the mare made her settling sound. Naiche's low voice answered her, saying something in a language I'll never know, and she quieted. 19 days to the auction. One paper on the table that might be a rope or might be a straw. And Clete Harmon, sitting up straight for the first time in 3 years, was going to have to walk into that bank in the morning and do the hardest thing there is for a man who's given up. He was going to have to hope out loud in front of another person where it could be taken from him. I didn't know yet if the banker would say yes. I didn't know if the foal would live. I didn't know a great many things that morning would start to answer. But I knew this. 3 days back I'd found a man in a field who'd stopped feeling his own skin. And tonight that same man had turned down a gift because he loved it too much to let it fall with him, and then let himself be talked into catching it, and had told his fool neighbor to set down a weight he didn't need to carry. That's not a man who's given up. That's a man coming back. The bank in Thurman was a low brick building with a flag that never flew right because the pole was bent, and I'd hated it my whole life, the way a man hates the place that holds the paper on his land, and I'd never once been inside it for a happy reason. I drove Clete in. He'd have walked before he asked, but I didn't ask. I just had the truck running at his gate at 7, and he came out in the one good shirt he owned, the funeral shirt, and got in without a word, and I understood. A man goes to beg for his life in the same shirt he'd wear to bury it. Naiche rode in the bed with the paper in his coat because he wouldn't let it out of his own hands until it was on the banker's desk. He'd carried it 15 years. He wasn't going to lose it in the last 20 miles. I'm going to tell you the bank part quick, because the truth is it was quiet, and the quiet was the worst of it. The banker's name was Fenner, youngish, younger than his job, the kind of man who'd learned to say no so many times a day it had worn a groove in his face. He looked at Clete's funeral shirt. He looked at me and knew what I was there for. And then Naiche laid the paper down on his desk. The Sonora contract, the breeding letter, the standing offer with the sum on it, and turned it to face him and stepped back and said one sentence. "That's what's coming out of a horse in that man's barn, and it'll pay his note in full, and I'll swear to any of it in front of anyone you like." And Fenner read it. He read it twice. I watched his eyes go over the number, and then over the signatures, and then he did a thing I didn't expect. He took off his glasses and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes like a man who's tired all the way down. And I realized, with the same surprise I'd had about the assessor, that this was a man who hated foreclosing on farms and did it anyway because it was his job, and it was killing something in him one farm at a time. "I've signed 9 of these this year," Fenner said, "meaning foreclosures, meaning 9 families. 9, and not one of them ever gave me a way out. They just drowned in front of me, and I held the paper that pushed them under, and I went home and couldn't tell my wife what I did all day." He put his glasses back on. He looked at the contract. "This is the first thing anybody's brought me in 3 years that isn't just a man crying at my desk." He didn't say yes right there. Bankers don't. There were calls to make to the man in Sonora who was, thank God, alive and gruff, and confirmed every word and added that he'd been trying to buy that line for 15 years and would Fenner please for the love of God make this happen. There were papers to draw. There was a vet to send out to confirm the mare was bred and sound, and that was its own held breath, 2 days of it, before old Doc Pruitt came out and put his arm where a vet puts it and said, "Bred solid, 4 months along or near it, good strong heartbeat," and I saw Clete grab the stall rail to stay standing. But the short of it is this: the auction on the 29th did not happen. Fenner turned 19 days into 18 months. A forbearance, he called it. A fine banker's word for "I'm giving you a chance no rule requires me to give." The note stayed. The land stayed Clete's, conditional on a knife's edge, dependent on a foal not yet born. But the chalk came off the gate. The for sale sign came out of the ground. And Clete Harmon drove home from that bank in his funeral shirt with the paper folded in his pocket, and halfway back he said, to the windshield, not to me, "I don't know how to do this." "Do what?" I said. "Have something to lose again." He watched the dry country go by. It was easier when it was already gone. "You can't be scared of losing what you already lost." He was quiet a mile. "Now I've got 18 months of being scared every single day that the foal comes wrong, or the man in Sonora changes his mind, or the mare." He stopped. "Hope's heavier than I remembered, Eli. I'd forgot how heavy." "It's the heaviest thing there is," I said. "Grief's light next to it. Grief you just carry, hope you've got to carry and protect." Clete looked at me like I'd said something surprising, and maybe I had. My Ada was the one used to say wise things. I was the one who counted. But I'd been around grief and hope both long enough to know their weights, and I'd have traded every wise thing I ever failed to say for the 11 years and 4 months I'd been carrying my own light, unbearable grief. The summer was long and it was good, and I won't dwell on it, because a happy stretch makes for poor telling, and you don't need me to walk you through 18 calm months. I'll give you the shape of it. Clete came back to himself by inches. It wasn't a sunrise, it was a season. Some mornings he was the old ornery Clete arguing with me about fence lines, and some mornings I'd come by and find him sitting on a bucket in the barn just watching the mare, gone somewhere in his head, and I'd sit on the other bucket and count boards until he came back. The field where I'd found him he plowed under in June and put to a cover crop, not for the money, there was no money in it, but because he said he couldn't have that ground just lying there being what it had been. I understood. Some ground you have to change the shape of, or it'll keep being the worst night of your life, every time you look at it. Naiche stayed on. I didn't expect it, and neither did Clete, but the man's truck part never quite got ordered, and then it was haying season, and an extra hand was an extra hand, and then it was fall, and somehow Naiche was still in the hayloft he'd claimed the first night, and nobody said anything about it because saying something would have made it a decision. And this way it was just how things were. He and Clete were easy together in a way that took me a while to place, and then I placed it. They were easy the way men are easy when they've both stood at the same edge and stepped back. They didn't have to explain themselves to each other. Naiche had worn the look, Clete had worn it, and a man who's worn that look doesn't need the other one to talk about it. They just knew. I was jealous of it a little. I'll admit that. I'd been the one who climbed the fence, and I'd never wear the look, never had, not even the worst of losing Ada. I'd wanted to keep living even when living was mostly counting the days without her, some flaw or grace in me that kept my hand off that particular door. So I was on the outside of the thing those two shared. But I'd rather be the man on the outside who never wore the look than be inside that brotherhood. It's not a club you want to be eligible for. The mare grew heavy through the winter. Clete watched her like a man watches a fire in a drought, half in love, half in terror. He read old horse books by the lamp. He asked Naiche the same questions 40 times. He was, I think, the most alive I'd ever seen him, and the most frightened, and those turned out to be the same thing, because a man who has nothing to lose feels nothing, and a man who feels something can lose it, and there's no third door. That's the deal. Naiche told him that once plain. You wanted to stop hurting back in that field. There's only one way to stop hurting for good, and you know what it is, and this, he'd nodded at the heavy mare, this is the other price. You feel it or you feel nothing. Pick. Clete picked feeling it. Every scared day he picked it. The foal came in March. Almost exactly a year to the day from the night in the field, which I noticed because I notice everything, though I never told Clete the dates lined up. Some symmetries a man's better off not knowing about his own life. I was there. Clete wouldn't have had it otherwise. He'd called me at 2 in the morning, and I'd driven over in my nightshirt with a coat thrown on, and the three of us were in that barn by lantern light for the whole of it. And it went wrong. I have to tell you this part true, because I promised you at the start I wouldn't make it cheap, and the cheap version is the foal drops healthy and everybody weeps for joy. That's not how it went. It went wrong the way birth goes wrong, and I'll not walk you through every hard minute of it, but the foal was turned. A leg back wrong, the way that kills mare and foal both if it doesn't get fixed and fast. And there was a stretch in the deep of that night, maybe 40 minutes, maybe an hour, where I watched Naiche with his arm in that mare to the shoulder and his eyes shut, and his whole self poured down into his hand trying to feel and turn what he couldn't see. And Clete kneeling at the mare's head with her big frightened eye rolling white, saying her name over and over, saying stay, stay, stay. And I stood by the wall and I did the only thing I know how to do, I counted. I counted her breaths. I counted them because if I counted them they couldn't stop. That's the child's logic a scared man falls back into. And I counted and I counted, and there was a stretch where they came slow and far apart, and I thought this is it. This is where the hope breaks. This is the crueler thing than never hoping at all, because I could see it on both their faces. Both men who'd worn the look, and I thought, if this foal dies, it takes the farm and it takes Clete with it, and there'll be no climbing a fence to fix it this time. And then Naiche said, very quiet, not triumphant, just a fact laid down in the dark. There, got it. And he had it. The leg came right. And then it came fast the way it does once it's right. A rush and a slither and a great steaming wet weight into the straw. And Naiche fell back onto his heels with his arm red to the shoulder and his chest heaving. And the foal lay there in the lantern light not moving. Not moving. Nobody breathed. I stopped counting. There was nothing left to count. And Clete Harmon, who'd lost his wife and his son to distance and his farm to the drought, and had sat in a field with a gun because the losing had hollowed him out. Clete crawled through the straw to that still wet foal, and he did not weep, and he did not pray. He just put his two big cracked hands on its ribs and rubbed, hard, rough, the way you do. The way 40 years of being a stockman had taught his hands to do without his head, rubbing life into a thing that hadn't decided yet whether to have any. And the foal sneezed. A little wet, ridiculous sneeze, and shook its soaked head, and pulled one impossible long leg up under itself. And it was a filly, bay with a white star. Same as the one Clete's grandfather gave a hungry man 90 years before. The whole line come round in a circle back to the mark it started with, on the same ground, in the same family's barn, and I am not a man given to signs, but I stood against that wall with tears running into my collar, and I thought, some debts don't get paid off. They just keep being paid forward forever, the same star handed down the years. Now, here is where I could end it, and it'd be a fine ending, and it'd be a lie by omission, and I've come too far with you to lie. The filly lived, she thrived. And when she was weaned, the man from Sonora came, in a truck worth more than Clete's whole farm, and he looked at that filly a long time, and he paid the sum on the 15-year-old paper without a word of haggling, and he shook Naiche's hand and called him a fool for waiting 15 years, and thanked him in the same breath, and he loaded up the star-marked filly and drove her south. And Clete Harmon watched the last of his grandfather's blood, the exact repayment of a 90-year-old kindness, get driven away down the section road in a rich man's trailer. And it paid the note, every dollar. The farm was his, free and clear, saved, exactly as Naiche had promised in the kitchen a year before. But I want you to sit in what that cost, because that's the part the cheap version skips. Clete didn't get to keep the miracle. He got to keep the farm. But the thing that saved it, the star-marked filly he'd rubbed to life with his own hands at 3 in the morning, that he'd have died before selling, that was the very living picture of everything the whole year had meant. That he had to hand to a stranger and watch drive away, because that was the deal, that was always the deal, the foal for the farm, and a deal's a deal. He stood at the gate a long time after the trailer was gone. Same gate the assessor's truck had come through. Same 11 minutes and more of standing still. I walked over. I didn't climb the fence this time. I'm too old and the season was different. I came through the gate and stood by him. You all right? I said. No, Clete said. And then yes. And then honest, the way that year had taught him honest. I don't know. Both. I got my grandfather's ground and I lost my grandfather's horse to keep it, and I can't tell you which of those I'll be feeling tomorrow. Some mornings it'll be one, some mornings the other. The mare came to the fence beside us. The dam, the mother, still Clete's, still on Harmon ground, exactly as Naiche had sworn. The mare stays yours, cropping the spring grass like nothing at all had happened, like she hadn't nearly died in the night, like her only daughter of the last cross hadn't just gone down the road forever. Animals don't carry it the way we do. That's their kindness to us, I think. They just keep grazing, and their grazing tells you the world goes on, and you'd better go on with it. Naiche came and stood on Clete's other side, the 3 of us at the gate. Charlie'd have laughed, Naiche said. At what? Clete said. At you thinking it's over. Naiche nodded at the mare, and I followed his eyes, and it took me a second, old as I am, slow as I was that morning. And then I saw it, the way she stood, the fullness that shouldn't have been there yet, and I did the arithmetic, and my heart came up into my throat. She's bred again, I said. It wasn't a question. Bred her back, Naiche said, before the filly ever hit the ground. To a stud 2 counties over I traded 3 days' work for. Charlie's blood on the mare's side, good new blood on the other. He was almost smiling, that way he had, just the corners. The Sonora man got 1 foal. He didn't get the line. The line stays here. He looked at Clete and the smile went all the way up, the first full one I ever saw on him. You didn't lose your grandfather's horse, you stubborn fool. You sold 1 foal and kept the mother and started the line over on the ground it began on. In 2 more years you'll have another star in that barn, and it'll be yours, free and clear, same as the farm. And Clete Harmon put his hand over his mouth. And I turned away, the way I do, and I found something to count, and there was the fence, and I counted the posts down the line of it, all the way to where it ran out at the far corner of the ground his grandfather broke with mules, the ground that was his now, the ground that would hold a new star-marked foal before it held Clete himself, someday, out past the far posts where his people were buried. The mare grazed. Naiche went to check the barn. And Clete stood at the gate of the farm he'd nearly given up on in a field with a gun, and I stood beside him not saying anything, because I'd learned the whole year long that the not saying was the thing, and the two of us watched the light come up over ground that a stranger's 40-year promise had.